Imagine a man who's known for his sheer strength, his fearlessness, and his absolute refusal to back down from anyone. That was Umar Ibn Al-Khattab long before he became one of the most respected figures in Islamic history. But here's the twist: in the beginning, Umar was not a friend of Islam. He wasn't curious about it. He wasn't neutral. He hated it. Joe Rogan leans forward in his chair. Wait, hated it? Like, why was his problem with it? And the answer is important because it's the starting point of one of the most powerful transformations in human history. Umar grew up in a society where strength was everything. The Arabian desert in the 7th century was a place of tribal pride, where honor and toughness defined you. He was a warrior, a man people didn't want to mess with. And in his eyes, Islam, this new message brought by Muhammad Dinado, was a threat, not just to his tribe, but to their entire way of life. Think about it. The Qur'an was telling people to abandon idols, to treat the poor with respect, to free slaves, to see all humans as equal. To us now, those sound like powerful moral principles. But to the elites of Mecca back then, that sounded like an attack on their social order. Joe shakes his head. So you're telling me the stuff that's obviously good, kindness, equality, justice, was actually the reason they wanted to shut it down? Exactly. Because it meant breaking down the hierarchy that kept the powerful in control. And Umar, he was fiercely loyal to his tribe, fiercely loyal to their traditions. So naturally, he saw the Prophet as an enemy. The thing is, Umar wasn't just an ordinary critic. He was intense. If he believed something, he went all in. And that intensity soon turned into open hostility. There's a story that's been passed down for generations, a story about just how far Umar's hatred went. One day, in pure rage, he decided that the only way to end Islam was to end the Prophet. He took up his sword, ready to march through the streets of Mecca, with one mission: to kill Muhammad bin Adil. Joe pauses, wide-eyed. Hold on. This guy literally went from "I hate Islam" to "I'm going to assassinate the Prophet." That's insane. Yeah, it sounds extreme, but it's real. That's how deep his opposition ran. Now here's where it gets even more fascinating. Umar's confidence wasn't just physical strength, it was also his personality. He was known for speaking his mind without fear. He could face down anyone, and people often stepped aside when they saw him coming. So when word spread that he was walking through the streets with a sword in his hand, people didn't doubt what he was about to do. They believed he would, but Allah had written a different story for Umar. And that story, the one that would completely change him, begins right here, at the peak of his rage. Joe leans back. So you're saying the guy who's literally on his way to kill the Prophet somehow ends up being one of the Prophet's closest companions? Exactly. And that's what makes Umar's story so unbelievable and so powerful. Because when you think about it, most of us believe people can't change. We see someone with a bad temper or with extreme views, and we think, no way, that's just who they are. They'll never change. But Umar's life proves the exact opposite. Not only can people change, they can change so completely that they end up fighting for the very thing they once tried to destroy. Now let's step back for a second. What exactly was going through Umar's mind during those early days? It wasn't just blind hate. He genuinely thought he was doing the right thing. He believed Islam was dividing his people. He thought it was breaking apart families, disrespecting their gods, and weakening Mecca's power. And here's the part that Joe finds most fascinating. It wasn't like Umar was an ignorant man. He was intelligent, he was respected, but sometimes even smart people get locked into a way of thinking so deeply that no amount of logic can break it, until something completely shakes their world. Joe nods slowly. That's what's wild. You can be totally convinced you're right, until you get hit with something that makes you go, wait, have I been wrong this whole time? Exactly. And for Umar, that something was about to happen, but not in the way anyone expected. Before we get to that turning point, it's important to understand the scale of his personality. Umar wasn't just a strong man physically. He was strong in his presence, his voice, and his decisions. When he walked into a room, people noticed. When he spoke, people listened. That's why his opposition to Islam was such a big deal. Because when someone like Umar stood against something, it gave others confidence to oppose it too. But here's the thing about life. Sometimes the people who fight the hardest against the truth are the ones who are actually closest to accepting it. They just don't realize it yet. Joe raises his eyebrow. That's deep. So basically, the more intense someone is about their hate, the more potential they have to flip completely. In many cases, yes, because intensity is energy, and when that energy gets redirected, it can transform into unstoppable commitment. That's exactly what was about to happen to Umar. But at this point in the story, he had no idea. To him, the plan was simple. Find the Prophet Ali bin Adel, kill him, and end Islam before it could spread any further. That's where we leave him in this first chapter of his journey. A man with a sword in his hand, fire in his eyes, and not even a hint of doubt in his heart. A man seconds away from making a decision that in his mind would save his people, but in reality was about to lead to the complete transformation of his soul. Because sometimes the road to the truth starts with walking in the exact opposite direction. He's walking fast, sword in hand, jaw tight, every step echoing in the hot Meccan air. Umar Ibn Al-Khattab is on his way to kill the Prophet Muhammad Ali bin Adel. In his mind, this is justice. This is protection. This is saving his people from what he sees as dangerous ideas. But before he can reach the Prophet's home, fate steps in. Someone spots him, sees the sword, and asks where he's going. When Umar tells them his plan, they freeze. And then with a mix of fear and quick thinking, they say, before you go to Muhammad, maybe you should check on your own family first. Your sister and her husband, they've accepted Islam. Joe Rogan leans forward. Whoa, so they basically just threw his sister under the bus. Exactly. But whether it was an attempt to protect the Prophet or just to delay Umar, it worked. Because in that moment, all the rage he had toward Islam suddenly turned toward his own blood. And here's what's wild, in that culture, family honor was everything. Your family's choices reflected on you. So to Umar, this wasn't just religious disagreement, it was betrayal. So he changes direction. Now the man with the sword is heading toward his sister's house. Joe shakes his head. This is like the setup for a crazy movie scene. And it really is. Because what happens next doesn't just change Umar's life, it changes the entire course of Islamic history. When he gets to the house, he hears something. It's not conversation, it's not the sound of food cooking. It's words, rhythmic, flowing, unlike anything he's heard before. Inside, his sister Fatima and her husband are with a teacher, reciting verses from the Qur'an. They don't know Umar is at the door. Joe interrupts. Wait, hold on, he's about to bust in on them reading the Qur'an, with a sword in his hand. Exactly. And that's exactly what he does. Door bursts open. The atmosphere in the room changes instantly. Umar's eyes lock on the parchment they're holding, the verses they've been reading. But he doesn't care what they are yet. He's furious. He turns on his brother-in-law first, and a physical struggle breaks out. When his sister steps in to protect her husband, he strikes her too. And for the first time in this story, Umar sees blood. Not from an enemy in battle, not from a stranger, from his own sister. That moment is like a crack in the wall of his rage. It doesn't break him yet, but something shifts. Joe's voice drops. So the guy who's supposed to be unstoppable suddenly sees what his anger has done to his own family. Exactly. And instead of cowering, Fatima stands tall. Her voice is steady. She says, yes, we are Muslim. Do what you will. Now here's the thing. Umar wasn't a man who respected weakness. But he deeply respected courage. And the courage in her voice made him pause. He sees the parchment in her hand. He wants to know what's written on it, but she refuses. Not until he cleans himself first. This was out of respect for the sacred words. Something that even in his fury, Umar can't completely ignore. So he washes. Then he sits down, the sword still beside him, but for the first time his hands are open, not clenched. Joe whispers, this is the moment, isn't it? Yeah, because now Umar begins to read. The verses are from Surah Taha, words revealed to the Prophet Ali bin Adel. In Mecca, they speak about the greatness of God, about his signs in creation, about his knowledge of all things. They call people toward truth, not with threats, but with beauty. And here's what's important. Umar was a master of the Arabic language. He knew poetry, He knew rhetoric. He knew when words were powerful, and when they were just fluff. But these words, they weren't like anything he'd ever heard. They weren't poetry, but they were more beautiful than poetry. They weren't just statements, they had weight, like they were speaking directly to his soul. Joe looks amazed. So, in that moment, the guy's brain is basically short-circuiting. Everything he thought he knew just doesn't line up anymore. Exactly. Because up until now he saw Islam as a political threat. But now, he's seeing it as something else entirely. Something divine. And here's the wild part. The verses he read that day weren't about him personally. They weren't calling his name. But the truth in them hit him so hard, it might as well have been written just for him. It's like when someone tells a story that perfectly matches a pain, or a doubt you've been hiding. You didn't expect it, but it reaches right into you. Joe nods slowly. Yeah, I've had moments like that. Something just clicks and you're like, this is true. I can feel it. That's what happened to Umar. The rage that had been his fuel just starts to fade. Not all at once, but enough for him to see clearly for the first time in years. He looks up from the parchment. The room is silent. His sister and her husband are still tense, still unsure if he'll turn on them again. And then he says something no one expected. Take me to Muhammad. Joe raises his eyebrows. That's a plot twist. It's more than that. Because remember, just minutes earlier, Umar was on his way to kill the Prophet bin Adel. Now he wants to meet him, face to face, with a different purpose entirely. We don't know exactly every thought that ran through his mind in that moment. But we know this. The man who walked into his sister's house was driven by hate. The man who walked out was driven by something else. Something powerful. Something unshakable. Something that would not just change his life. It would change history. Because the next steps Umar takes will lead him straight into the presence of the very man he once swore to destroy. Umar Ibn Al-Khattab is now walking toward the Prophet bin Adel. But this time his sword is no longer raised in rage. It's still at his side because that's who he is, a warrior, but the fire in his eyes has shifted. It's not anger anymore, it's purpose. When he arrives at the house where the Prophet bin Adel is with his companions, the atmosphere inside is tense. Someone at the door peeks through, sees Umar standing there, sword strapped to his waist. They know his reputation. They know the stories, and in that moment they don't know if he's here to fight, or to finish what he started. Joe Rogan tilts his head. Yeah, because if you've got a guy who's famous for wanting to take you out, and suddenly he shows up at your door, you don't exactly roll out the welcome mat. Exactly. Some of the companions even suggest attacking him first, to strike before he can strike. But the Prophet bin Adel, he doesn't flinch. He says let him in. Now picture this. Umar steps inside. The room is full of men who just days ago feared him as one of the harshest enemies of Islam. He locks eyes with the Prophet bin Adel, and for a moment no one speaks. It's like the air itself is waiting. Then, Umar says the words that will echo through history. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Joe's eyes widen. Whoa, he didn't just think about it for a while. He just came out with, right there, right then. No hesitation. It's hard for us today to grasp how dangerous that was. This wasn't just a personal spiritual decision. This was Umar publicly declaring allegiance to something his tribe was violently opposing. It meant putting a target on his own back. And here's what makes Umar's story even more intense. He didn't keep his new faith quiet. Some early Muslims had to practice in secret for fear of being beaten, imprisoned, or worse. But not Umar, he says. If this is the truth, then why hide it? Joe leans forward. So this guy basically goes, yeah, I'm Muslim now, tell everyone. Exactly. And that's exactly what he does. He marches to the Kaaba, the heart of Mecca, where the leaders of Quraysh gather. This is the place where the most hostile opponents of Islam are watching. And right there in front of them all, Umar prays openly as a Muslim. Now imagine the reaction. The people who once saw him as a defender of their idols are now seeing him bow to the God of Muhammad bin Adel. It's a shockwave through Mecca. Joe shakes his head. That's like if the loudest critic of something suddenly becomes its biggest supporter overnight. People lose their minds. They did. Some tried to stop him. Some shouted. Some threatened violence. But Umar was Umar. The same strength and fearlessness that once made him an enemy now made him a shield for Islam. From that day on, Muslims in Mecca could pray more openly. simply because Umar's presence deterred their enemy. It's said that before Umar's conversion, Muslims could not openly worship at the Kaaba without fear of attack. After Umar, they could. Joe pauses. So the same guy who was going to kill the Prophet ends up making it safer for Muslims to pray. That's wild. It is, and it's a reminder of one of the most powerful truths in life. The same qualities that make someone dangerous in one direction can make them unstoppable in another once they're guided by truth. Here's something else. Umar wasn't just a bodyguard for Islam now. He became a student. He learned directly from the Prophet al-Banadal. He asked questions. He wanted to understand not just the words of the Qur'an, but the deeper wisdom behind them. And here's where Joe gets reflective. That's the part that gets me. It's not like he just switched sides he actually changed who he was inside. Like, he wasn't just protecting Islam, he was living it. Exactly. His change wasn't surface level. It wasn't political, it was personal. One of the companions later said that when Umar became Muslim, it was like Islam gained strength overnight. Not because the truth was suddenly more true, but because one man's conviction can inspire hundreds more to stand firm. Now think about the speed of this transformation. In a matter of hours, Umar went from hunting the Prophet al-Banadal to standing by his, from being feared by Muslims to being one of their protectors, from wanting to silence the Quran to reciting it in public. And here's the part that hits the hardest. This wasn't just a feel-good story. Umar knew that declaring his faith meant he would be tested. He knew the leaders of Quraysh wouldn't forgive what they saw as a betrayal. But he didn't care. Joe nods slowly. Yeah, that's like the definition of conviction. When you're ready to take the heat for what you believe in. Exactly. And Umar would take the heat many times in the years to come. But this first moment, this public declaration, was the spark that changed the tone of Islam in Mecca forever. It's one thing to convert quietly. It's another to walk into the heart of enemy territory and live your faith open. Umar's courage didn't just protect Muslims. It inspired them. And here's the deeper point. Sometimes the people we think are the furthest from the truth are just one moment away from it. And when they find it, they don't come in halfway. They come in all the way. That's what Umar did. The man who once stood as the wall against Islam now became one of its strongest pillars. But this was only the beginning. His journey of growth, humility, and leadership would continue shaping not just his own life, but the destiny of an entire nation. And the question Joe leaves hanging in the air is this. What does it take for someone to change like that? Is it just the right words at the right time? Or is it something deeper, something from God? The answer would reveal itself in the years ahead. So we've seen the moment Umar Ibn Al-Khattab, R.A. stood up and declared his faith in the most public, fearless way possible. But what does his incredible transformation actually teach us? Why does his story matter not just in history books, but for anyone watching today? Joe Rogan leans back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. You know, when I hear stories like Umar's, I can't help but ask myself, what makes someone actually change? Not just superficially, but deeply, like what pushes a person from total opposition to full-on belief? That's the million-dollar question. Umar's story shows us something powerful about faith and about the human heart. It's proof that no one is beyond change. No matter how angry, how lost, or how set in their ways they might seem. Think about it. Here was a man who once saw Islam as his enemy, who was ready to kill its prophet al-Banadal, who even struck his own sister in his rage. And yet, he became not only a believer, but one of the greatest leaders in Islamic history. Joe pauses. That's like hope, right? That no matter how dark things get, or how far you think you've gone, there's still a chance to turn it all around. Exactly. It's the ultimate story of redemption and transformation. But there's more. Umar's change wasn't just about abandoning hate. It was about embracing humility. Before, Umar was fierce and proud, trusting his own strength and opinions. But after his conversion, he began to recognize something even stronger than himself. He realized that true strength comes from surrendering to a higher truth. Joe nods slowly. That's real power. When you're not trying to control everything yourself, but you trust something bigger, right? And here's a lesson that hits home for so many of us today. We live in a world where pride often gets mistaken for strength. People hold tightly to their beliefs, sometimes to the point of stubbornness, refusing to question themselves. But Umar's story reminds us that asking questions and being open isn't weakness. It's courage. The courage to admit you might be wrong. The courage to seek truth, even if it means stepping into the unknown. Joe reflects.
You know, that's something I've seen with a lot of people on my podcast. The ones who grow the most aren't the ones who just double down on their view. It's the ones who listen, who wrestle with their doubts, and who are willing to change. Exactly. And there's another layer to Umar's transformation, the power of the Qur'an itself. We saw in part 2 how a few verses moved him deeply. That moment wasn't just about words on a page. It was about the divine wisdom inside those words. Wisdom that cuts through anger, confusion and fear. Joe leans in. So you're saying the Qur'an, it's not just a book, it's like a force that reaches people on a level they can't always explain. Yeah, it's like the Qur'an speaks directly to the heart, in ways that logic alone can't reach. That's why Umar's story isn't just about history. It's about the ongoing power of faith to change lives today. And this is where it gets personal. Think about your own life. Maybe there's something you've held onto, an old grudge, a fear, a belief, that's kept you stuck. Maybe you feel like change is impossible because you've tried before and failed. But Umar's journey shows us that change can happen suddenly. Sometimes it just takes the right moment, the right words, or the right experience to unlock a new path. Joe's voice softens. I guess that means you can never really write someone off. Even the people who seem the hardest to reach. Exactly. Because transformation doesn't come from force or pressure. It comes from opening the heart. And here's the final big lesson from Umar's story. Leadership isn't about power or control. After his conversion, Umar became a caliph, a leader who ruled with justice, mercy and wisdom. But he never forgot where he started. He remembered his own anger and hate, and used that memory to build a fairer, kinder society. Joe reflects, that's true leadership, not just telling people what to do, but leading with empathy, knowing what it's like to struggle. Right. Umar's legacy shows us that real leaders are shaped by their journeys, by their failures and by their breakthroughs. And that's why his story still inspires millions around the world today. Because no matter where you come from, no matter what mistakes you've made, there's always a chance to rewrite your story, to become better, to be a force for good. Joe pauses, then asks quietly, if someone like Umar can change so completely, what's stopping the rest of? That question hangs in the air. It's a challenge, a call to action, because Umar's transformation wasn't magic. It was the result of courage, openness, and divine guidance. And those same forces are available to every one of us. So the story isn't just about history. It's about you. It's about all of us. Now, after everything we've seen, the fierce opposition, the powerful encounter with the Qur'an, the bold public declaration of faith, and the deep lessons of transformation, it's time to ask, what kind of legacy did Umar Ibn Al-Khattab leave? Joe Rogan sits back, thoughtful. Man, this guy went from being the biggest enemy to maybe the biggest hero of Islam. But what happened after? How did his change actually impact the world? Great question. Because Umar wasn't just a convert. He became a leader, one of the most influential figures in Islamic history. After the Prophet passed away, the Muslim community needed strong, wise leadership. And Umar stepped up. He was chosen as the second caliph, the successor to the Prophet's palace, in guiding the growing Muslim nation. Joe nods, intrigued. So from a warrior with a sword, to a leader with the weight of an entire community on his shoulders. Exactly. And Umar didn't just rule with power. He ruled with justice, mercy and an unshakable commitment to fairness. He created systems of governance that protected the rights of all people, Muslims and non-Muslims alike. He stood up for the weak, the poor and those who had no voice. He wasn't a tyrant. He was a servant of the people. Joe leans forward. That's the kind of leadership we need more of today. Absolutely. Umar's reforms transformed society. He established courts, improved the welfare system, and set standards for ethical leadership that still inspire people centuries later. And here's the amazing part. He never forgot his own past. He remembered how close he was to being on the other side, how his anger could have destroyed everything. Joe reflects quietly. That humility, that self-awareness, that's huge. Not many leaders have that. Umar's legacy isn't just in laws or conquests. It's in the idea that true strength comes with humility, that justice requires compassion, that leadership is about service, not domination. And because of that, his story transcends time and culture. Millions around the world, Muslims and non-Muslims, look to Umar as a model of transformation and leadership. Joe smiles. So his story isn't just about religion or history. It's about human potential. Exactly. Umar's life challenges us all to think about our own journey. Are we holding on to anger or hate that's stopping us from growing? Are we willing to listen, to question, to change? And maybe most importantly, are we ready to lead, with courage, humility and justice? No matter where we start. Joe leans back, eyes thoughtful. That's powerful. It makes you realize that no matter who you are, or what you've done, there's always room to grow and make a difference. And that's the lasting message of Umar Ibn Al-Khattab's story. That even the fiercest opponent can become a champion of truth. That even the hardest hearts can open. And that the choices we make in those moments define not just our lives, but the lives of generations to come. Joe's voice lowers, almost in awe. It's humbling, makes you wonder what kind of legacy we're each leaving behind. So as we close this chapter on Umar's incredible journey, remember this: his story isn't just a story from the past. It's a living reminder that change is possible, that faith can transform, and that true leadership is born from courage, conviction, and compassion. And with that, we leave you with a final thought. What moment, what choice might change your life forever?